was God good to me? Was God's goodness anything in any way connected to my idea of goodness? Because the fear I had was that, like, the religious goodness I grew up with, which I would say with Paul was a righteousness under the law, was a beautiful thing, but it still led to death. There was no answer for these yearnings of my soul and the existential pain I was really, and when I tried to ask people about it, their own pain would rise up in reaction, which convinced me that they hadn't really addressed it.
Right.
And like, okay, this is not an answer. That's what led to this quest where I had to reconcile with myself, reconcile with God. And to me, the paradigmatic verse that was really the inflection point was because, like, and this is the thing to me that I always, when I talk to intellectuals, say, okay, look at reality, tell me what you see. And are you willing to stare into the hard, cold face of reality, and are you willing to live in consistency with what you say you see? Because most atheists I know are what I call hypocrites of the best kind. They claim that life has no meaning, and that human beings have no choices, and yet they often work very hard to serve other people and make good choices. And it's like, do you really believe that, or don't you? And if you do, why, or why not? And so, you know, the thought experiment goes like, okay, there's this world here, and there's all this horrific, you know, suffering and hypocrisy, and yet there's these moments of grace and beauty and kindness and compassion. It's like, where did that come from? Why does that work? Why does that speak to us? And so, and you know, people choose sides. Well, God is all goodness and the evil's all Satan. Or, you know, well, all this God and religion stuff, that's where all the evil comes from. You know, what is natural is good.
Hey, yo, welcome to the Godcast.
The Lord told me to tell you, wake up, wake up, wake up.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!
Was there an awakening moment?
So this is like an all-encompassing awakening.
It's all-encompassing.
Every day, as they would creep in, I would just have to stop and catch myself right in those moments and say, God, I trust you. I'm not going to be afraid. I'm giving you my fear.
And I also came to the understanding of what you're saying, what you can't have light without dark. But then I started having the thought of, well, if we didn't have nighttime and we didn't have the winter, then plants would never stop growing. So if we never had issues, then we would only grow more. The thing with me, I never got into the astrology stuff. I never got into really doing any kind of energy work until I was very firm with Jesus. And it's a thing with me and Jesus where, like, people are praying and I'll get the sudden urge to tell that person to give your burdens to Jesus, and they'll say, like, oh, I was just trying to talk to Jesus.
Welcome to Godcast,
the Goodness Over Darkness podcast.
Here's your host, Emmanuel Kingman.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Godcast, the Goodness Over Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Emmanuel Kingman, and here with me is the good doctor, Mimi.
Good doctor. Hello, everybody.
Hello. If you
Dr.
didn't notice,
Mama
I like
here.
I like introducing you.
You just like me to laugh, that's all.
Well, yeah, but I like to do with the theme of the show with our guests, because I don't know if you've noticed that.
I haven't noticed.
Well, go back and listen, because I always do it that way.
Okay.
So today's episode, we had on special guest Dr. Ernest Prabhakar. And I hope I said that right. I probably didn't, but it's I tried my best to pronounce it. But Dr. Ernest, Dr. Ernie, or Ernie The Sinner, as he goes by at times, he is a great talker. He is he has a lot of different perspectives and and stories, and the way that he started, and then it was like 50 minutes in, there was like a connecting from the beginning part. Like, it was just a beautiful setup, the way that the whole thing worked out. So he has physics degrees from Caltech and MIT. He's a former Apple employee for a long time, worked under Steve Jobs.
Yeah. 17 years. That's a long time.
Yeah. And I mean, he's greatly intelligent, and also, just by happenstance, he is a great Christian, and not necessarily Christian, but he is a man of Christ, and he is doing a lot of great work in that, and his understandings and his what he does in his day-to-day life to try to bring Christ on earth. I mean, we were saying the same things just in different terms, which is a thing we kind of got into towards the end, was about language, how it's the way I say it is there's too many words and not enough. They're not exact, and but sometimes they really hit home. So, but I don't want to give away what we talked about in the episode completely. But it was just very interesting to talk to him and his experiences, and also his family is from India, so he's a second generation immigrant. He was. I think he said he was born right around the time that his parents moved here. I don't know if it was like right before or right after during the Vietnam War. Um, but he's a ninth generation Christian, and he went back to when Christianity came to India is when his family, his lineage, was introduced into that. So that was a great story. I mean, there's just a lot of different things in here where it's not a conventional. I'm not conventional. I mean, all my guests know, or I'm sorry, all my audience knows I'm not conventional at all. Mimi and I, we like to branch out, and he is not conventional either. And it was a great relationship that has been budded here today. So, do you have anything that you wanted to get into?
I had so many things I wanted to squeeze in.
Yeah,
There was no opening.
Yeah. Well, it happens.
It happens.
Yeah. Well,
We'll have to talk about certain things on an episode with us, because I think it's
Yeah, you were writing a lot.
yeah. But I think that the information that I was writing down that we could talk about could be an episode in itself.
Okay.
So, I'll hold it.
Yeah, we'll try to get that.
I do think that he said that his ninth generational ancestor was the person that was appointed by the King of Denmark to travel to India to spread Christianity.
No, he was the one that baptized his ancestor.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Gotcha.
then he was given the name re-Christianized, or not re-Christianized, but Christianized in the name of Aaron.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so there was one thing that I wanted to touch on, that we talked about the story of Lazarus, and I didn't get a chance to say it to Dr. Ernie, but the story of Lazarus is very interesting in that Jesus waited until the fourth day, because back in those days that they waited until 3 days to declare that you're dead. So
Is that right?
Yes. So he waited an extra day so that everyone knew that he was definitely dead before he raised him. And why?
Before he wept.
Yeah. What do you mean before he wept?
Go ahead.
Well, why everybody wanted him to, come on, come save his life. He had to wait. He had to fulfill prophecy. I don't even know if that was prophecy, but he had to show who he was, and that was the perfect opportunity. That it was his, most close. I don't want to say the most close, but the people that were very close to him, their family member was dying, and he said, "Okay, well, I can't do anything yet. God won't allow me to. The Father won't allow me to." It's not something he said necessarily, but that's just what was going on. That it wasn't time just yet. We had to learn patience, and because he waited until after 4 days, well, now everyone knows he's dead, and I just raised him from the dead, and that was a precursor to what he came back himself after 3 days of being dead. So it's there's a lot of traditions and understandings that we in our current day knowledge don't have. We don't know exactly why things were done a certain way. Like,
Right here, you're like already in the ground within 3 days.
oh yeah,
You're like, oh no, you're dead.
yeah. I definitely by like the 5th day on average is at the funeral. But yeah, you're definitely embalmed and everything like the 2nd day at least. But I mean, it's completely different times, the medical industry and what have you. So, it's neither here nor there how it happens, but it's a big difference. Like when we talk about Jesus saying, the Son of God, or calling God the Father, well, that has implications that we don't understand. And it's because of our language and because of stories getting passed down. It means he's saying he's God, because in those days, when you say your father, or you say you're the son of, the son and the father are equal. So when he claims that, then he's claiming he is God, and that's really controversial. So our understandings, we can't take information from them back then and transplant it into us now and our understandings. We have to transplant ourselves and our perspective into who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, cross reference it against the times, and understand why they used the language that they used. It's just a lot of different things go into it when we start to try to understand the biblical stories. And the more that I start to open the Bible and read it myself, the more I start to see how different things are playing out, how different things are meant to be something as a sign, because as a people, the Jewish people needed signs from God to be shown what was real, to be shown that it was the Messiah. So he did these signs, and those people still didn't believe, but he was doing what they wanted. But God doesn't work how we exactly think it's going to work. Anyone knows that has a prayer answered. It's not answered in the way you think it's going to be answered. Like, you say, I want a new job. Well, guess what? You're probably going to get fired, or the business is going to shut down, and then you'll get a new job, and it'll be an amazing job, and it'll fit in all these different ways. But it's not going to work out the way that you think it will. It's because we can't be exact enough with what our wishes are when we're trying to ask for something. So it's just interesting to keep all that in mind when we're going through the Bible, when we're combing over it, is to figure out why things were the way they were back then, and then you'll have a greater understanding. So do you have anything else for the intro, my love?
That's it. Late dinner for us.
Yes, ma'am. Well, it's good because I was feeling very ill before the interview, so I was not in any position to eat. So I had some
Feel better
ginger.
now?
Yeah, I had some lemon and ginger cold tea, and it
As
made me
advised
feel
by
better.
the doctor.
Yes, the good doctor in blue. All right. So make sure you go check out Dr. Ernie's website and his podcast. You can find, I'll have the links in the description. You can find them on different platforms, YouTube and audio platforms. Make sure you go to my website, emmanuelkingman.com, IMMANUEL Kingman.com. And there you can send me a message if you need a free consultation for something. You want to work with me one-on-one for whatever reason, you want a consultation, you have anything to talk about that you need to get off your chest, just send me an email, send me a DM in any of my social media. You can find all my social media on the website. Go to my YouTube channel, Goodness Over Darkness, hit that like, subscribe, and share button. A comment. I haven't been getting a lot of comments lately. I don't know what it was, but I got a whole bunch of subscribers. Well, not a whole bunch, but to me it was. I hit the 500 subscriber mark, and I stopped having people comment. And I get a bunch of likes, but people haven't been commenting. So if you guys want to comment when you're watching the videos, it really helps the algorithm. It'll help me grow. That would be greatly fantastic if you could all do that.
Yeah, share your favorite episode with someone.
Yeah, that would be wonderful if you would all do that. Also, send me an email with the subject line Bible study if you want to be part of the Bible study. It's going to be starting. So by the time this episode comes out, it'll be Sunday, so it'll be next Sunday, March the 6th, 8 p.m. Eastern. We will do the Bible study. So send me just send me an email with the subject Bible study so you get the Zoom link and you can participate in it. I'm going to be upping my website. I'm going to be kind of revamping how I do the podcast a little bit because of personal things happening in my life, as well as what God is calling me to do. So I'm going to have more interactive things going on if you become a member of the website, which I will get that up and running probably this weekend. So I hope that you all have a good night, and after the bridge will be the interview with Dr. Ernest Prabhakar.
Welcome to the Godcast. Cross up on my back, I'm slaying demons. It don't matter what you call that. Searching for the truth, facts are facts until they fall flat. It's looking like a story, man, it's all cap. But it's goodness over darkness, it ain't all bad. I'm at my maker, but I was called back. Emmanuel, show my people they're under a spell. Heaven or hell is free will. I made my choice and now it's well with my soul. I pray the same for you as well. Welcome to the Godcast. Welcome to the Godcast.
Hello, everybody. On today's episode, I have on a guest who has physics degrees from Caltech and MIT. He is a 9th-generation Christian and 2nd-generation immigrant from India. He is a student of spirituality and cutting-edge disruption theory. Everybody welcome Ernest Prabhakar to the show.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the show, Ernest. Thank you for being here. Did I get your last name correct?
Close enough. It's usually pronounced, well, it's usually mispronounced, but my parents try to have me pronounce it Prabhakar.
Prabhakar, okay. Oh, sorry about that.
Took my wife 9 months after we met for her to learn to pronounce it, so.
Well, not so bad then.
Yeah.
All right, so welcome to the show. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Oh, goodness. I think the short version is I have been becoming a Christian all my life, in that every decade I feel like I'm discovering anew what it means to follow Jesus or to be in love with Jesus. And the difference between loving Jesus, following Jesus, being a Christian, all these subtle things that can become really esoteric discussions, but can also be very life-giving clarifications. And so you mentioned I have a degree in physics. I've kind of been on this quest to try to understand, who am I? Who is God? How does it all fit together? And I guess that's as good an introduction to me as any.
Wow. So, I mean, there's some good points in there, some really good points in there. And I do want to talk about Jesus because, I mean, I love Jesus, Team Jesus, he saved my life. And it's interesting that you're a 9th-generation Christian and a 2nd-generation immigrant, meaning that when your family was in India, 7 generations had converted to Christianity. So that's a very interesting topic for me to come across.
Sure. So a little bit of church history. So you've all heard of the Protestant Reformation, but as you may know, it was a very tumultuous time in Europe because of all the religious wars that broke out with the dissolution of the hegemony of the Catholic Church. And so it was a while later that the newly incorporated Protestant kingdoms wanted to reach out across the world. So there was a guy named Ziegenbach, who was a German pietist, one of the first sort of lay movements of spirituality. And he was appointed by the King of Denmark to go to India. So he was the first Protestant missionary. And he arrived in a place called Tranquebar on the east coast of India. And he baptized a number of people. And one of them was a Hindu who took the Christian name Aaron when he was baptized. And he became ordained as a minister. So he was the first Protestant minister outside of Europe and one of the first Protestants outside of Europe in general. And he is my 9th-generation ancestor.
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting. It gets to some of the themes I wanted to touch on with you. I noticed that you have a, what's the right word for it? Eclectic journey to Jesus and with Jesus. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. My journey
That's a good word.
my journey with Jesus is it's quite expansive, and it happened like it was kind of like I had my back to him the entire time to try to figure out what this place is, what's going on, where are we, who am I? Like you were saying, all these questions, but I kept him behind me. Like, no, that's not real. That's not true. And then finally, I got to the point where I was like, well, let me turn around and let me see if this is real. And what happened for me? I mean, it's history. I talk about Jesus nonstop. He saved my life. He showed me that the deception that I was in, and still to this day, he reveals more and more to me how I can connect with people who are still in that deception. So he just reveals and reveals and reveals and tries to bring me to the truth of Christ. But yeah, it's very I mean, we have quite the connection, him and I hear him audibly, I hear him telepathically, I feel his presence. It's a very strong connection I have with him now.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that I just listening to some of your podcast and a little bit is that a lot of your experiences don't neatly fit in specific theological boxes.
Correct.
And what's interesting, my story is kind of a story of Catholics and Protestants and Hindus. And I think that, and maybe this will help make sense of your own spiritual journey, survival is important. If you don't survive, nothing much else gets done. And there's a lot of things that Christianity and the gospel and the story of Jesus that took for it to survive. Whether it was the Israelites annihilating the Canaanites, whether it was Nehemiah forcing the Israelites to divorce their pagan wives, whether it was Jesus getting nailed to a cross, whether it was the church fathers making peace with the Roman emperors, right? Whether it was Martin Luther kicking off the 40 Years War or the 30 Years War and all the massacres and nationalism and anti-Semitism, which grew out of the Protestant Reformation. There's a lot of awesome and awful things in our heritage. And one of the challenges is that there's things that we do because they're the really representative of Christ, and they're things we do just to survive. Like a simple example of this is Christmas. I love Christmas, right? But Christmas started as a sort of baptized version of a winter solstice holiday common in Germanic Europe. That's really the roots of it. And yet it's brought enormous joy and gladness to the world. But there's, when people decry about the commercialization of Christmas and like, why can't we get back to the original spirit of Christmas? Well, what is the original spirit of Christmas, right? Was it the pagan holiday? Was it the Roman Catholic Church that us Protestants have since disavowed that created all these masses and festivals? So it's our heritage is both richer and messier than most of us like to think.
Yes.
And there's a verse that's really been a comfort to me and a challenge. It is at the end of Malachi where it says, I will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of children to the fathers, or else I will strike the land with a curse. And for me, a lot of my journey as an immigrant, as a Christian, has been to going through this rhythm or cycle of really pressing in and appreciating and identifying with that heritage and that lineage, and then reacting kind of violently against that lineage and that heritage as I see some of the hypocrisies and compromises and things like that. And then learning to come back with compassion rather than anger for those fathers who have let me down, knowing that they were operating under horrific circumstances where their own fathers had let them down, all the way back to Adam.
Right.
And so I think we're in a really extraordinary phase in terms of religion, spirituality, Jesus, Christianity, civilization, where a lot of the old tribal structures that helped us survive are breaking down, and people are either fighting viciously to try to hold them together or giving into despair. And occasionally I feel like there's people like you, perhaps, who are trying to forge a new path. And that's really, really, really hard. Yeah. Because some of the people that you think of as allies probably think of you as the enemy.
Yes.
Because you're friends with other people that they think of as their enemy.
Yes.
And so that's a challenge that I've been wrestling with in different forms over the last several years. I can either give you the long, painful historical narrative, or I can share some of the more elegant summaries and hopeful ideas going forward. Which would you prefer?
Well, so I do like the history, so I would like
yeah, the long version.
the longer version sounds appealing to me.
All right, well, we got time. So I dream of writing an autobiography called All the Right Mistakes, the hilarious failures and improbable success of a physicist in Silicon Valley. So still kind of waiting on the improbable success, but I've got a lot of hilarious failures to start with. And in some ways, I like telling the story through the lens of failure. And to this, I'll go all the way back to Adam. And I grew up kind of in a religious tradition that kind of dumped on Adam and also dumped on Eve a little bit. And I kind of grew up with that. But as I was going through my own journey, making peace with my father and my fathers and my traditions, I realized Adam did something quite extraordinary, which is extraordinarily rare. The way I like to tell the story, this isn't necessarily biblical or theologically correct, but it works for me, is that the thing happened with, actually, if you, I've been told that if you read, the verse where God tells Adam not to eat the fruit of the tree, it's you singular, not all of you, just you. And so the idea was that, of course, he was the only one at the time. So Eve shows up and he says, Eve, do whatever you want, but there's one rule: don't eat the apple. And so he tries to pass on the rules that God gave him, which is a reasonable thing to do because, hey, God is good. This works for me. It should work for you too, right?
Right.
So he tried that. But then what happened is he put pressure on her to do what God was telling him. And I don't know if you two are married or what your history is together. But I noticed that when I want to get something done and I'm afraid of not getting it done, I will tell my wife to remind me or help me. And if she fails to remind me, then I blame her rather than taking responsibility for myself.
Right.
And I feel like that's what Adam did with Eve. It's he put all this pressure on her. When she failed, it's crap. And
that's
so he
a
just
very good point.
Right. And so I was thinking, okay, that's the first failure we make. God tells us something, which is absolutely essential for us to do, but then we try to make everyone around us do the same thing. And that ends badly. All right. Part two, he goes, okay, that didn't work. So with my kids, I'm not going to make the same mistake. I'm not going to tell them what to do. Cain, Abel, you go worship God in your own way. That didn't work out too well either. Because they didn't have any context and they end up fighting with each other and killing each other. One kills the other. And there's a whole other fantasy story I've written about that, but that's another podcast. But the way I like to think of the story is that I'm sitting here, crap. I try to tell people what God told me, it ends badly. I try to not tell people what God told me, it ends badly. What in God's name am I supposed to do? So he gets another chance. This is one of the things I love most about God, is that he doesn't give up. And he gives Adam another son. And Adam says, okay, I can't tell him what to do. I can't not tell him what to do. I will tell him what I did and how it turned out, so that, as my friends at Bethel like to say, my ceiling becomes his floor. And what Adam did that I love about the Bible, and I now love about him, is he took the fall. He said, whatever you do, I think it was Seth was the third child, let people know that this is what happened and I screwed up. And you can blame me as long as you remember I'm not good, but God is. Because there's no other way Seth would have known that story if Adam hadn't told him every shameful detail of how he threw Eve under the bus with the apple.
Wow.
And I was thinking, and you mentioned you have these experiences. I just remember meditating and processing this. I go, and I don't like sharing my intimate failures in public. I'm getting better at it, but it's still a challenge. And I just thinking to set yourself up as the fall guy for all of human civilization, basically, because nobody else in that generation, even if he wasn't the first human, he was the first human to tell a story against himself and pass it down. And I remember thinking, oh my God. And I heard a voice say, no, Ernie, oh my God. Because Adam wanted to be known as the man who met a God that was so good, he was willing to make himself a complete fool so that people would know how good God is.
Wow.
Okay, that's going way back. Let me jump ahead a little bit.
Well, that's an incredible story. I just want to say I've never heard it put that way, but that makes a lot of sense, and I can see how you spent a lot of time thinking about that. That is a great story. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, you're welcome. So jumping ahead, well, let me jump a little bit ahead. One of the things that has always mystified me, and I haven't done real research into this. I have some friends who have. I need to hit them up on the details. Is that the Christian church started out in the first century as what we would call an emergent movement, right? There was just a lot of apostles wandering around, baptizing. They would meet together periodically, but it was very distributed and dispersed. And but somewhat between that and the second century, something happened. And this in Corinthians, where Paul is complaining about how people are making a mockery out of the Lord's feast, people are getting drunk. And you figure what probably happened was some guy who's like the guy running the house or running the city said like, hey, come on, behave yourselves. This is the Lord's table. Let's keep ourselves, let's show God a little respect here, right? And this was a really good idea because the groups that didn't do this faded away into obscurity, right? It was an important thing for a strong man to say, hey, let's behave ourselves. Let me decide what is right and wrong. Let's have some knowledge of good and evil here so we don't misbehave.
Right, structure.
Some structure. And that was like necessary. But within a generation or two, suddenly only the bishops were allowed to take communion. And were only to enter into the Lord's presence like that. And then they devolved that out to the presbyters or the local preachers, which became what we called priests. And suddenly, through some bizarre series of events, these priests became celibate men who answered to the bishop, who were sort of the holders of biblical authority. And as a good Protestant, I've always sort of been offended and upset at the Catholic Church for doing this. But when I look at the horrifically difficult circumstances that they were in, and how there are lots of different sects trying, it's like, this was the group that survived. That was the price that they had to pay in order to keep the gospel and the story and the continuity, or we would never have heard it. And this really came home to me when I heard stories of Eastern Christianity, because the gospel spread to India, which is where my wife's family comes from, the west coast of India, which has a tradition going back to the Apostle Thomas, or at least the first few hundred years BC, called Thomite Christians or Mar Thoma Christians. And what happened is that, but the gospel also went to like China and Japan. But in those civilizations, the emperors crushed Christianity and obliterated it. I'm told that the Japanese tea ceremony is actually a cryptic evolution of communion as practiced by early Christians.
Wow.
I haven't been able to prove that one way or the other, but it's plausible. The gospel went everywhere, but it didn't survive everywhere. Only the places where it made sort of the deal with the devil of making the pact with the Roman emperors to keep them alive on both sides did Christianity survive. And that's why we have the books. That's why we have the tradition. And, living with this dichotomy of like there was just such some horrible compromises and evil things that were done, but that's the only way we got all these good things. I mean, living in America, it's kind of the same thing. We look at the horrific things that happened to the Native Americans and the African Americans, but like without that, we would have no civilization.
Right.
And so this whole thing that's really been challenged me, and just really what I'm dealing with really this very month as we go into Lent, is the knowledge of good and evil was necessary to keep us alive, but it is also the very thing that is killing us. So the way this intersects with my personal story is, as my parents arrived in the US just before I was born, I was telling someone that it was actually during the Vietnam War where the U.S. needed more doctors. So my dad, who had been training in India, was brought to the U.S. as part of that.
Wow.
And which was like when you think about it, kind of a weird, one of the great tragedies in America's history is the reason I'm here. It's like, you have to kind of, I don't know what the right emotion is to have about like these really awkward truths in our history.
Right.
But one consequence of that is that I grew up bicultural, and I felt very confused about my identity between my, what I guess missionaries call the host culture of America and the home culture of my parents. And the way I reacted to that was trying to find absolutes. So I would study theology and I would study physics. And I didn't think of it at the time, but looking back, that seems like I was really trying to find absolute truth so I could ground myself and have a grounding of my identity, because culturally, everything I did was offensive on one side or the other.
Right.
Either I do exactly what my parents want and lose myself, or I do what I want at the risk of offending my parents. And it was a no-win situation. And so I grew up very religious, I had different encounters with Jesus along the way, but I hit a wall in my 20s and ended up in a bunch of addictions, and didn't quite fall as deep as some did. Like I still held down a job, I still went to church, but I was very empty inside. And it was only in my 30s that things kind of erupted, and I was forced to go through some really deep counseling and inner healing, if you're familiar with the term. And that's when I really started learning Jesus in a whole new way in the early 2000s. And I've been kind of working that out ever since into different levels of my heart and soul. And so the interesting part of the story, maybe to pick up on, is I was working at Apple Computer under Steve Jobs, and I was working on a technology that I was trying to productize inside of Apple, and I hit a dead end. And I suddenly realized I'm not willing to let this go. So I kind of hit my midlife crisis and left Apple to go do a startup. And that led to a hilarious series of misadventures and learning experiences, which many would call failure. And it's really forced me to dig deeper into who I am, what is true, what is real. And the big thing that I learned in 17 years at Apple was that you cannot convince people about something that is new using words, because words can only refer to past experiences you've already had. And so Apple was a master. I don't know if you're even old enough to remember this. When the first candy-colored iMac came out, in 1997, when I joined Apple, Apple was about 6 months away from bankruptcy. And then Steve Jobs pulled a coup and took over the company. And every time I used to dread taking a cab to the airport. I don't know if you remember cabs, but all these things I have to explain to my children that they have no knowledge of.
I'm familiar with cabs. I'm familiar
good.
with Apple. I just didn't know what year that you were.
Yes, 1997 to 99, Apple was like on the edge of bankruptcy. And it was people were, and the funny thing was, every time I would take a cab to the airport and they find out I was from Apple, the taxi driver would lecture me on what was wrong with Apple and how to fix it. That's life in Silicon Valley. Everyone's a venture capitalist at heart.
Yeah.
Just like everyone's a screenwriter in Los Angeles. And so, but then we introduced the candy-colored iMacs. All anyone wanted to talk about was their favorite color iMac. And this was the thing that my boss, a guy named Brian Kroll, really taught me. I worked in the product marketing group. And he said, and my job was to market the new Mac OS X in 2001 to scientists and engineers. And he got me in a room and said, Ernie, this is really important. Most people think that if you're marketing to scientists and engineers, you need to give them nice logical arguments because they're really logical people. That is the worst possible idea, because they are so smart and intellectually agile. They will argue with you just for the fun of it, to impress their friends, even if they agree with you.
Yep, they'll pick it apart.
Yeah. And so what you do is you go, look,
what
shiny.
color do you want it? What color do you like?
If you look at it, and then if you hook them emotionally, they are so emotionally immature. They have no emotional defenses whatsoever.
Wow.
And I thought about
great
this.
Marketing technique, I guess.
Yeah. And the point is, and when you look at how Jesus interacted in the Gospels, he did the exact same thing. I mean, occasionally he would stop and give a little sermon to wrap things up, but mostly went around interacting with people and like bugging the hell out of them, quite literally, by just giving them experiences that just didn't fit their brains. And it took, a few centuries for people to even invent the right words to halfway talk about it. And so when I left Apple, it occurred to me that, and this was in 2014, it kind of feels to me like institutional Christianity is about 6 months away from bankruptcy, in that we're not just financially bankrupt, there's a lot of that going around in a lot of older churches, but we're increasingly morally bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt, and emotionally bankrupt, if I didn't say it already. And like, I live in between the two worlds. I can see all the sins and the horrors of the institutional church, but I can also see all the hypocrisy and wimpiness of the non-institutional church. And and being a dad, there's this daily tension between authenticity and efficiency. Like, do I try to tell my children what I really feel, or do I tell them what I think will help them not be traumatized? Right? Do I do what makes them happy in the moment, or will help them be successful in the future? These are hard choices. There's no trivially easy answers. And like, we need to maybe embrace the paradox. We talk about Jesus as God and man, as the Word made flesh. And like, these are paradoxes that words don't easily capture. And yet they're vital to what it means to be human, to be real, to be with Jesus, to be in love. And so my idea when I created my startup was, okay, if we want to save the world, if we want to evangelize the nations, if we want to preach the gospel, words no longer work. People are trying to use words that were really powerful 400 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. But the cultural reference have been lost, and we're using them like magical incantations without understanding the reality. So we need to give people an experience of what the kingdom of God is like.
Exactly.
And I think a funny story is, so I was having this conversation, I was praying, it's like, okay, God, I got this brilliant different startup. It's going to be $1 trillion. It's going to revolutionize the software industry and bring the kingdom of God on earth. And God said, no, you're not ready for that level of success. I go, okay, I'm up for training. I went through 11 years of higher education. I know these things takes time. What do I need to learn to be ready for that level of success? And God said just 2 things: listening and suffering. And I go, any chance I could do more listening and less suffering? And God says, how do you think you learn how to listen? And I have found that to be true.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's a great point.
And so I went through like 7 startups in my first 2 years out of Apple, ended up in this dead-end IT job, and was really depressed and acting out in all sorts of ways. And then God has been slowly rebuilding things. And really, I think even this conversation with you, as sort of last minute as it is, this whole month and this year, I really feel is like the end of the 7 years of famine and the beginning of the 7 years of plenty, to reverse Joseph's dream, if you will. And I feel like as I have learned to, I don't know if you've seen Hamilton.
The play? Yeah, I've seen bits and pieces, not the whole thing.
The character, the villain, actually, Aaron Burr, one of his lines is, talk less, smile more, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for. And the tension between him and Hamilton is the central, one of the central issues of the play. And I realized that as an intellectual, I like to find out things and tell them to people. But I end up telling them things partly to validate myself and partly to help them. And I end up burning bridges, throwing pearls before swine. And so I just feel like I'm finally getting to the place where I'm secure enough in my ideas, secure enough in my identity in Christ, secure enough in God's sovereign control over everything, that I can rein in my indignation and my Messiah complex and my pride and childish delight in my own cleverness, to be able to see where people are and share things that will actually help them move one step closer to where God is taking them.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to railroad them to where I really think you should go, and it would make me much happier if you were living your life this way.
Right. Bring them to where you are and try to make them have your perspective and your experiences. It's just something that doesn't work.
Yeah, which would be a great place for me to stop, catch my breath, let you process a bit while I get a drink of water. I'll keep listening
Yeah, no
in.
problem.
And then let's think about what would actually be useful, not just to you, but to your listeners.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So I did want to say it's interesting. You said you feel that we're at the end of the 7 years of suffering because 7 years ago is when I was in prison, and it was actually Cinco de Mayo is the day that I prayed to God for the first time in over a decade. So every 7 years, our bodies change. As I'm sure you're well aware, our cells completely change in 7 years. So we're completely new people in 7 years. So it's interesting that that it's working out that way. So what I try doing with my clients, especially people I do consultations with, is I meet them wherever they are. And with me, I have a wide ranging variety of people who like my show, who come to me for assistance. There's people who are in dire need of some therapy. There are some people who are in dire need of medical attention. And then there's some people who are pretty level spiritually and they want to know how they can evolve. So I come to people exactly where they are. I don't force anyone to do anything. I like to listen to people, hear them tell me where they are, so then I can redirect them to say, "Oh, you know where you are and you know what you need to do next." And I kind of just guide them to that position. It's uh what I try doing, the one thing I try doing is Proverbs 3:5 is don't rely on your own understandings. You know, I forget exactly, but it's give your understandings to God so that God can change it. Because I have full belief in Jesus Christ. I have full trust that what Jesus Christ has done for me and is still doing for me, he can and will do it for everyone. He will meet them wherever they are. And if they have bad habits that I don't agree with, I don't need to exactly point that out because Jesus will do that as he walks with them. But if I'm the one that points it out to them, then they are going to then look at me as if I'm the bad guy. And that's how I started my awakening. I became the bad guy to a lot of people by telling them what was going on in the world, running down the aisles and screaming, look at all the stuff that's going on. I did it completely the wrong way. I think that most people do it that way. But I've learned that, okay, I need to make friends with everybody, no matter where they are. And then I make friends with them and then I tell them a hard truth. And then they can accept that I'm coming from a place of I'm your friend here. I'm not someone who's trying to hurt you. So, what my audience might need right now, I think that we're in a place where we we want to know how Jesus is. I don't want to say real, but uh, we want to know how Jesus can be effective because we're in America where we think that it's a white people religion is the Christianity, and you coming from India, and you not only coming from India but being an intellectual with multiple degrees from these great universities. You don't really fit the mold for someone to fall in love with Jesus Christ, to have that at your disposal the way you do. And of course that's not a great way of putting it, but to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. So it's very interesting, and I would like to explore how you came to understand Jesus the way you do, because a lot of intellects, they like to outthink, as we were just saying, they like to outthink everything, and they think that they can outthink Jesus Christ and the Gospels and the Bible, and that it doesn't apply to them. So I would like to know, how is it an emotional thing that did it for you? Was it a personal revelation, or was it that you pondered these hard to understand concepts that are provided to us through the church and Bible?
Yeah, I like to say I have lots of little quotes that I use. One of them is that the universe is infinitely multidimensional and complicated. The only way we can understand anything is through grace, inspiration, and hard work.
Yeah.
And I think that, most people would agree with this in principle, but because I grew up bicultural, my daily lived experience was that things that were obvious to other people were mysterious to me, and things that were obvious to me were invisible to other people. It's like, I felt like I was like a half step out of reality.
Right.
And so that was why I wanted to kill myself when I was age 13, is because reality
wow.
just seemed insane. I was self-aware going through junior high school. So I could see all the insanity that everyone else was doing and how futile and self-destructive it was, and that I was doing the exact same thing and it was going to end just as badly. And it's like, God, I don't want to deal with this. I want out. But if you're real, my parents love me. They want me here. They say you're real. What can you do? What do you got? And I'm still kind of working it out with him. But so far, he has proved himself faithful, and I have not. So I figure I should bet on him instead of myself. So the title I've been using, I used to go by Dr. Ernie when I got my PhD because it's easier than trying to explain my last name to people. Also, my whole family is medical doctors. My dad, my brother, my wife, they're all Dr. Prabhakar. So I went by Dr. Ernie. But just in the last month, I've been going back to a phrase I picked up a little while ago, which is Ernest the Sinner. Because the one thing I had going for me when I came to Jesus at age 13, the insanity I saw in junior high, and it probably isn't limited to junior high, is that everyone wants to be loved and accepted as they are. But there's two problems. One problem is that nobody actually loves anyone else like that.
Wow.
And that's right. But that's the easy problem. The hard problem that I saw, and if I have any genuine insight spiritually, I think it comes down to this. I realized that even if someone loved me that way, I was too flawed to accept that kind of love.
Wow.
And that was why life seemed a cosmic joke. And so I had an encounter with Jesus. I went through the evangelical sort of Bible route, doing Bible studies and correspondence courses and things like that. And it worked pretty well up to a point. But I hit this wall where I was attending a really prominent evangelical church in Southern California, and with some great pastors, great teaching, people with all these degrees and mission agencies and great kind of God. So I said, okay, this is the place. And I went there and said, I want to be discipled to be a real good Christian, as we did in that tradition. And so they introduced me to this guy, and I met with him. He says, okay, are you doing your Bible studies? Yeah, I've been doing quiet times every morning. Do you tithe? Yes. Do you go to prayer meetings? Yes. You're good, Ernie. You are doing all the things you're supposed to be doing. And that was good for a couple of years, but then I realized I'm not happy. I'm still single. I don't have love. There's these pains that no one seems to be able to talk about or explain. And I just kind of hit this wall with God. I said, God, I believe you're real. The evidence is overwhelming from my perspective the simple intellectual argument is that the universe as it exists has experiential components like consciousness, colors, notions like justice and truth. It has physical components like atoms and quarks and photons, and it has mathematical components, Newton's laws of motion, Einstein's equations of general relativity. So whatever created the universe plausibly has to have a relational, experiential, as well as a physical and a mathematical basis for creating the universe. And that's what I define as divinity, the thing that produces the observable universe. So to me, that thing was real. Like, there's no question about that. Now the question is that thing good? Right. The first question is, was that thing one? And before Einstein and Newton, you could have made an argument, well, the world is just chaotic. But the world is just rigorously ordered from top to bottom.
Right.
There must be a unitary principle of some sort tying this all together, even if we don't know what it is. And so the fact that God is one and that God is real, whatever name you choose for it, that seemed to me incontrovertible. The hard question is God good? Now, you could make a case that if there's anything good, it must be God, because, what else do we have to measure it against? But the thing that was really hard was God good to me? Was God's goodness anything in any way connected to my idea of goodness? Because the fear I had was that, like, the religious goodness I grew up with, which I would say with Paul was a righteousness under the law, was a beautiful thing, but it still led to death. And, there was no answer for these yearnings of my soul. And the existential pain I was really, and when I tried to ask people about it, their own pain would rise up in reaction, which convinced me that they hadn't really addressed it.
Right.
And like, okay, this is not an answer. And so that's what led to this quest where I had to reconcile with myself, reconcile with God. And to me, the paradigmatic verse that was really the inflection point was because, like, and this is the thing to me that I always, when I talk to intellectuals, say, okay, look at reality, tell me what you see. And are you willing to stare into the hard, cold face of reality? And are you willing to live in consistency with what you say you see? Because most atheists I know are what I call hypocrites of the best kind. They claim that life has no meaning and that human beings have no choices. And yet they often work very hard to serve other people and make good choices. And it's like, do you really believe that? Or don't you? And if you do, why? Or why not? And so, the thought experiment goes like, okay, there's this world here and there's all this horrific, suffering and hypocrisy. And yet there's these moments of grace and beauty and kindness and compassion. It's like, where did that come from? Why does that work? Why does that speak to us? And so, people choose sides. Well, God is all goodness and the evil's all Satan. Or, all this God and religion stuff, that's where all the evil comes from. What is natural is good, right? I mean, and the way that I experienced it was this. I was reading the Gospel of John after going through all this counseling, and I was still kind of holding God at arm's length. And I read the story of Jesus and Lazarus. And this, for anyone who comes from a religious background, you might be able to resonate with a part of this. Jesus comes up. Is this a PG or an explicit podcast?
No, go ahead. It's explicit.
All right. This is probably not a sign you for word. I just got to be honest with what I was feeling at the time. Jesus comes across like an asshole. Because, like, hey, Jesus, your best friend Thomas is dying. Great. I'm glad I'm not here so he can die. What is up with that?
Reminds me of when he curses the fig tree. I'm like, well, that was mean.
Yeah, but like, it's a fig tree. This is your best friend, Mary and Martha, the two people who probably love you most on this earth. Their brother is dying. And Jesus says, yeah, I'm good with that. What is going on? And then he finally shows up. And Martha says, where were you? If you were here, my brother would have died. And Jesus goes, I am the resurrection and the life. It's like, what is up with that? Could you be any more cryptic and callous and cold? Like, where's the hug? Where's the, and when I was reading this, and this was the mindset I was in at the time, I didn't get struck by lightning, and hopefully you won't either. It's like, this is what it feels like to live life under God's law, is that God is pulling all these strings, and like, you have to fight for every scrap of compassion, every little achievement you can call your own. And all you get in return are all these cryptic statements that, well, if you can't figure it out, that's because you're stupid. And like, I just was so angry at Jesus. And then he gets to the tomb and he sees the stone. And Jesus wept. And I realized at that moment, I had always thought that the compassion and the Jesus loves you was the facade, and the reality was the hard, cold law of death. And it flipped, and I realized the heart of creation is the beating, pulsing, bleeding, pierced heart of Jesus, weeping over his creation. And all the laws, all the judgment is the facade that God holds up so that the universe doesn't collapse into the heart of his love. And that to me was it was the intellectually forced emotional encounter. So the intellect showed me the nihilism, the emptiness, the futility. And I come to the conclusion that all human wisdom is mostly useful for erasing our knowledge of good and evil. Because anything you stand on, going back to Kant or Socrates, you realize you end up in a web of contradictions. You can't prove anything. And you just end up like a skeptic wandering around doubting everything.
Mm-hmm.
And like, okay, you can do that, but you can't live like that. You can't
Right.
eat, you can't mate, you can't raise children.
You're unbalanced if that's how your take is.
You're untethered. But the paradox is that if you anchor yourself in anything in order to function, you immediately become a hypocrite.
Mm.
And this is the fundamental tension of being human. And I can't explain it except to say that that's the way God set it up, that logic itself is self-defeating, but it can lead us to the point where we realize we have no choice. And it takes us to this point where you have to say, are you willing to face the deep, unpalatable, unpleasant truths? The way that I process these is I write stories. So the therapy my pastor suggested was writing journal letters to myself. And then that went gangbusters. I had these long multi-part conversations with my different parts and fragments. And then I had lots of conversations with God, and first with Jesus, and then eventually, making peace with the Father, making peace with the Holy Spirit, and then writing stories about my past and my future. And recently I've been doing this really weird series on the Greek gods.
Oh, wow.
I just finished one on, I did a long one about redeeming Aphrodite, about love and addiction. And then more recently, a series on redeeming Aries, dealing with anger and masculinity, which is a hard thing for a child of the 80s and 90s to process. But the last one of the ones I wrote that's been really meaningful to me, I was talking with a friend I met on this app called Wisdom, where I've been hanging out from time to time. And he comes from a very different Christ adjacent tradition, I guess. We would call it a cult when I was growing up. I think that's probably too harsh of a word. But sort of in the marginal realm between sort of traditional Christianity and other things. Like they use the Bible, but they use it in a very completely different way. Anyway, and he's kind of has this awkward relationship to his own tradition. And I realized I have that same awkward relationship to the Western intellectual tradition. I grew up reading philosophy and hearing the stories of the Greek gods and philosophers and the classical scholars and C.S. Lewis and all these things. And I love that tradition. It's blessed me so much. But there's something there that was really bugging me. And so I went through and I do these crazy things. So I rewrote The Death of Socrates, one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy, where, and this is probably way beyond a lot of your audience's context. You can look it up online on my website if you really care. But the thing that I had Socrates do is he actually faces the contradictions in a lot of his positions. And he goes on a spiritual quest to try to find an answer. And at the end, he gets this answer from the Oracle at Delphi, which was this sort of pagan referee. And the word he gets is, the end of wisdom is folly. The end of folly is wisdom. Only in death is there life. And so I unpack that in the story of him arguing with Plato about it. And the thing that my character surprised me in these stories. You can say that's spiritual, you can say it's psychological. I don't get too hung up on that. I just write the story and I go with it. But what Socrates said was, I reached the end of everything I had known and believed in, and I stared into the utter abyss of nothingness when everything had been stripped away. But strangely, I did not feel naked or ashamed or alone. I felt loved and accepted by the abyss at the heart of the universe. And I think that to me is the place where intellectuals have to get to. If you follow all your logic, the things you say you believe to the end, you will end up at an abyss, a singularity. And frankly, intellectuals find it through their thoughts, or they should if they're honest with themselves. I think other people find it elsewhere. You found it in prison, I think.
Yeah.
mean, it's like
Well, I found Jesus actually in the astral realms, in the psychic and the psychedelic type of realms. That's where I first encountered Jesus.
Yeah, and I think that the answer is that there is a you have to have the desperation / moral courage. I can never really distinguish the two anymore, to get to the end of yourself and look beyond.
Yeah.
Because, and I mean, he said this like many times: unless a seed fall into the ground and die, it cannot live. And one thing, there's a framework I've been working on that I've kind of helped me kind of put this into context in my journey. Maybe it might be useful for some of your listeners for they can identify where they're at. The first stage is Advent. You're not really anchored on anything. You're just waiting for something that you know you're hoping will happen. And a lot of people are in that, especially if they don't have any religious tradition or whatever in. And then once you find that, you experience acceptance. It's like, yes, I am home. This is the truth I've been looking for. And you're like a child, and people tell you the truth, and you're just being fed, and it's so wonderful. So, phase 1 is the Advent, or maybe phase 0 is the Advent. You're waiting. Then phase 1 is acceptance. And, in phase 1, you need someone who is sure of what they believe, who has experienced something real, who can give you an anchor to start with. Because if you don't have that anchor of acceptance, you can't go anywhere else. The problem is that you have to go somewhere else. And the second phase is what I call abjection. So there's like pregnancy, which is Advent. There is childhood, which is acceptance. But then there's adolescence, which is abjection, which is a philosophical term, meaning like to eject from the body, like vomit or feces. And it says, this thing was a part of me, but it's no longer a part of me. And it's an individuating. So in the acceptance phase, you're connecting, you're part of something, you belong, you're happy. In the abjection phase, you're angry. It's like, dang it, these people lied to me. I got to be true to me. I got to be me. I did it my way, right? And like, this is also really important, but it feels like violence to people in phase 1 who are there. And it's like, okay, you've got it. And the deeper you are accepted, the more strongly you have to abject to push your way out of that. But that's really focused on the negative, trying to push away. The third phase is achievement, where you're trying to build something new. It's like, okay, this isn't about just getting rid of the Catholic Church. This is about building the Lutheran Church, building the German nation, right? And this is like young marrieds, right? You're mating, you're having offspring, you're putting down roots, you're building out a career, right? You're making something of yourself. And at this phase, you're building what I call ego points, right? The ability to make change in the world, to make your own way. And it's a lot of fun. It's really stressful and tiring. And then you hit this phase, which I call absolution, which is the midlife crisis, where you discover all these things that you've been building so hard are tainted with the same thing that you rebelled against as a child, as an adolescent. And all these ego points you've built up that you are so proud of turn into karma points you have to work off.
Yes, sir.
Right? So all my degrees, all my learning, all my professional success, I spent the last 7 years working through all those karma points, and like all the things that I said and believed, which may have had a grain or a ton of truth in them, have become millstones around my neck.
Yeah.
And so that's the phase of absolution. And it's like, crap, couldn't I have been a little bit less cocky, less sure of myself, and not dug such a deep hole I have to dig myself out of?
Yeah, it would be nice, but we did what we did.
But this is the thing. I'm planning to build like a game like this with my son. He's 13 and into game design. We may or may not do a Kickstarter on it sometime next year. We'll see what happens. The name of it is Quintessence, after our dog Quinn, which I'll show you later on the video if you like. But the fifth phase, which I'm starting to believe is actually happening this month, and this, just in the last few weeks, I feel like I'm making this transition. The problem with absolution, it's like the skeptic. You see how everything is futile, including everything you believed in. And like, if people come to you for advice, you say, I can tell you what didn't work. But you can't give people the comforting solidarity of level one, where it's like, hey, I got your back. I understand this. Because you see all the lies behind every truth you've ever believed.
Right.
But there's this fifth phase, which I'm just touching the edges of on. It's like Gandalf the White. and I call it Ascension. And what happens is that all the karma points that you dug out of your ego points become treasure points. They become the grace. Because you can look people in the eye, like I'm looking at you now, and say, hey, I don't claim to have all the answers, but I see something in you that I identify with. Like, I feel like I have been where you are in some place, and this is how I encountered the ultimate there. And I can't explain it perfectly. I can't promise you it'll work for you. I can just tell you, this is what I experienced in the best imagery and narrative that I can give you. Take it as a gift and do with it the best you can.
Right.
And
that's perfect.
And that's, that's Adam talking to Seth.
Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect.
And so that progression, and the thing that was really helpful for me is I get really frustrated at different people at different points, and realizing, are they in Advent? Are they in acceptance? Are they in Abjection? Right. Are they in achievement? Are they absolution or ascension? And like, I look at the guys in achievement and I want to yell at them to like get to the absolution. But I'm realizing, no, they need to dig as deep of a hole or build as big of a mountain as they can. And if they can make it through the absolution, they will have that many more treasure points to share.
Right.
And that makes me feel better about my old self and all the crazy things I invested in. It's like, yeah, in one sense it was futile, but like all of the universe in some sense is futile. We're all heading toward the heat death of the universe. But yet the glory is the things we do along the way that can then be redeemed for the glory of God and for the love of Jesus.
Christ the Redeemer.
Yeah, I think that process that you're talking about, to me, that's predestination. That's God's will. That's you coming around to God's will. I don't think more and more I'm thinking we are not free-willed individuals, because we all come around to fulfill God's will eventually.
I think that we're actually both. That I think that
you can make a choice.
I think that there's certain points that we're going to hit no matter what, and we have a lot of choices that we make along the way, and we can make it harder on ourselves or make it more difficult depending on what we choose. And at any point you can switch back and forth, but then you get to this level and it don't matter if you're over here, it don't matter if you're over here, you get to this level and you're at this level, and then all of a sudden you reflect and you're like, oh, I didn't actually have a choice, but you did have all those choices in between that were getting you to that stage.
Yeah. And I've gotten to the point where there are many things. I guess there's an Eastern koan about a Zen master who's saying to the group about him that I need to choose someone who understands the Zen to send to be the master of a new monastery. Mm-hmm. And he puts a chair in front of him and says, "What is this?" And the first disciple says, "It's a chair." He goes, "Wrong answer." And the second disciple goes, "That's not a chair." He goes, "Wrong answer." The cook comes by and kicks the chair out of the way. And he goes, "You have understood. You are the new master." And the thing that I have come to believe is that we have an addiction to words.
Yeah.
It started, at least in the Garden of Eden, maybe goes back further. And, words help us think, but they trap us. Mm. And words, I like to say words are mostly useless. But in moments of grace, words can become like deeds. And I think a lot of what we're doing even here is mostly performance art. Mm-hmm. It's like the fact that we are willing to put the effort and the emotional energy to be present and engage with each other. That's the real spiritual work that's happening. And you need a medium like words to do it. But it's like quantum physics is like this. Quantum physics is a great thing to study just to mess with your brain. And I remember when I was a sophomore, and freshman physics was great, but as a sophomore, they take you to quantum mechanics, and like people would just like yell at the professor because it was just so irrational. Because if you know nothing, it's fine. But if you actually dig deeply into the foundations of reality and physics, and you understand how beautiful and powerful and real it is, and then quantum physics comes and destroys all of it, it's deeply offensive.
Yeah, it's like the first rule of quantum physics is that physics don't actually apply.
Well, the rule is that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't really understand quantum mechanics. But the thing is that you get to this level of Zen where it's like, it just is. And is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is it Krishna's refrain? Well, like, I don't know what it really is. Words break down. So it's stupid to apply words that made sense in this context to expect them to be relevant here, right? What you can say is that I know what is true, and I know who I am and where I am, and therefore this is what I will do. Is that a choice? I mean, one of my favorite novels is C.S. Lewis's Perelandra, where he has this battle at the end with the evil one. And he says, like, and I couldn't tell whether, he has this transcendent experience. I can't tell whether, like, suddenly all external circumstances have been stripped away and I was finally making a free, unforced choice in a moment of pure will, or all my identity was stripped away and it was an act of pure predestination. It could be either or both. And at the moment, I couldn't even remember why they were supposed to be different.
So, well, let me ask you this. So, when we get to a point, so the way that I see that life operates is it's a bunch of tests that we're constantly being tested. And when we pass the test, we level up. But it's only through, and this is how evolution actually works, the evolution of consciousness is the real deal, is that it's always based on our free will decisions. So when we get to a test that we know how we responded before, and now we're observing that we're in the moment, and we have the option to do what we've always done or do something different. Now that is where free will comes in. Now, is it destiny that you were meant to do it at that moment? But then why wasn't it destiny to do it before? Why didn't you come to the understanding before? So that's where I really understand it's free will, because I always get to these points where it's like I am almost outside of myself and I'm seeing the situation, and it's like I just take a breath for a second and I'm like, the whole scenario runs through my head that this is what you did before and you failed. Do it this way. And then I do it, and it doesn't matter how many times I failed before, but when I do the new way, I'm like, oh,
I think that's where the need for experience and listening and suffering enters, you know, and you have to go through that to know which is the
and what correct. I would say, the language I prefer to use nowadays is you have a choice. So there is a choice. And at the time, it feels like free will. When I look back, I say, well, could I have chosen any other way? And so that's why I say it's like, it depends. It's like relativity. Like, are you moving or are you standing still? Well, it depends. Right. And I think free will and predestination is kind of like, it depends on how you're looking at things. And like, what does the word even mean? What is free? What is will, right? I mean, these are words that we have used in some context, usually in some arguments between philosophers. And it's like, okay, if that works for you, great, right? But the phase I'm at with regards to those terms, and maybe there's another layer where I'll be more clear about this in different ways, is that, you know, that's why I said the thing is that you have a choice. And whether you think it's predestined or free, like, there's a choice you are facing, and the choice you make will determine your destiny. And just to acknowledge that that is there. And the reason the part of me that believes in free will would say, you know, if I didn't have a choice, this wouldn't hurt so much, right? Something is dying to, and the best way to think about this, another word I love is the word decision. Because decide, I think, means like to cut.
Oh,
right.
Wow.
It's when you think about a quantum wave function collapsing, like, you have all these opportunities before you, but I'm going to marry this person rather than stay single.
No,
I'm going to, you know, leave my community in Southern California and come work at Apple when, you know, Steve Jobs just, you know, sold to the company, right? These are choices we make, decisions we make, where and what makes us human is that we decide. We sit there and we say, these things could be, I choose to identify myself with this path. And that is the experience of being human. And sometimes I think that it is like the noble will on this endless quest to form itself. And sometimes I feel like I'm just a character in a story being told by a god. And, you know, different perspectives are useful in explaining things, but all of them are really, it was actually useful. Someone once told me fairly recently on the Wisdom app words are just crystallized emotions.
Mm.
I don't know if that's entirely true, but it really spoke to me. And it's like, don't get hung up on words, because one, like crystallized emotions are not required to fit into a nice logical framework the way Aristotle wanted them to, and Plato tried very hard to make them fit in. Two, my crystallized experiences may not match at all your crystallized experiences, even if we're using the same word. And how divergent they are determines how much weight those words can carry.
Well, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
My first psychedelic experience, not my first one, but the when I did DMT for the first time, what I really got was that our language separates us so much, and it was just shown to me that look at all the different languages you all speak, and then within the languages, look at all of the different
etymologies.
The different slang or different ways, like
vernacular, dialects,
dialects, England and America. Then within America, you'll have different dialects in different areas. Then you have different slang words. So words, while we have so many of them, we don't have any that are precise enough to use it. It's like it's too many and not enough at the same time, because our words are generalized and it's not exact. I don't know that it ever could match what it actually means. That's the really difficult part.
Yeah, there is it's on my list of things to fix, is replacing the English language. It's a 5 on a scale of 10. So
it's magic.
Well, that's the problem. People think it's magic. It's not actually.
The way it's designed it's completely magical with all the double meanings.
It's rich and convoluted. No, but the evolution of languages. This is getting a little far afield, but maybe it's useful to think about this. Is we have experiences, right? And human beings. This is actually a fun little brain science lesson I heard. I don't know if this is the right explanation, but it's a really useful one. We have experiences in the right side of our brain, where we have sort of the spatial, sort of the analog unit of the brain that experiences things, that just takes it in there. And then it feeds through the amygdala in the middle of the brain, the hindbrain, and then it comes out into the left hemisphere, where it's tagged with labels and concepts, so we can reason about them. And so the idea is that you have to have the experience, it has to make it through the filter, and then you can use words to manipulate it, and then you can like make constructive action and deliberate and talk about it and things like that. But you've had experiences that you cannot put into words, right? Psychedelic or otherwise. It doesn't mean they're not real. It just means they're hard to talk about.
Yeah.
But then sometimes you'll have somebody say, "Oh yeah, that word you just used, that captures the experience. I believe you had the same experience I did."
Right.
It's like, wow, that is so cool.
Yeah.
And I really realized this when I was training my son's dog, Frolic. So my dog Quinn, he's scratching himself behind me. I'll put him on the video later. He usually Zoom bombs me about an hour in. He is very food motivated. He's very easy to train, except training him to keep away from food. But my son's dog Frolic is not nearly so food motivated, but he idolizes Quinn. So I wanted to train Frolic how to come and drop a ball to play fetch. And so what I did was I would throw Frolic the ball, he would grab it, and then I would call Quinn. And Quinn would come to me, and then Frolic would come to see Quinn. And then I would tell Frolic, "Fetch, good, drop." And he would drop the thing. I say, "Good, drop." And I realized I created an emotional encounter with him around something that mattered to him, that I linked it to a word and a context.
Wow.
And I was thinking, that is how language is created, right? Everything we've experienced, we had an emotional context, we had a word and an experience. And like once I understood this, it's like, this is why when I say justice or father or life, people have so many different meanings. And that's, like I said, words are mostly useless. And yet they're all we have to communicate precisely. And, just understanding that we have gotten into literally wars over words, on social media and in politics in general. It's like, you cannot use, I think it's an Einstein quote, you cannot solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created the problem. And Western civilization was created on a foundation of language, Latin, and logic, Aristotle, and so on and so forth, and religion, the Catholic Church, really. And so in order to move beyond that, and I think you've been doing that personally, and I'm trying to do this entrepreneurially, is moving beyond language and logic and religion. And yet you still have to use it. Like, I can't talk to you not using language, right? But I feel like, in ways that are difficult for me to articulate, you and I have experienced something of divinity and reality in Jesus that is deeply precious to us, that we want other people to experience.
Right.
And, we can connect around that, even if the words don't mean anything to anybody else. And that is how the human colossus, how global social consciousness improves. It's like, okay, I see you and I see Christ in you. And we see each other as, like, I call it, I was thinking a lot about what is the thing that is the scarcest resource for me, that if I could get more of it, I would be better. And I came with a triplet. I call it self-awareness, other awareness, and Christ awareness, or SOC, sock awareness, if you will, which is like my son's dog who likes to eat socks anytime he sees one lying around. But the idea is that to be self-aware, to know what we're thinking and feeling, to kind of get our amygdalas, getting the left and right sides to talk to each other, to be other aware, where people are not being so consumed with my own reality that I ignore other people's reality, but then being able to be enough Christ aware that I can handle not just the convenient, comfortable parts, but the deeply uncomfortable, offensive, ugly parts within myself and others. That is when the kingdom of God breaks forth.
Well, I'll tell you what, Jesus, he's the only person who ever lived that doesn't have one bad thing said about him or written about him or remembered in any way. Nobody who's encountered him in a spiritual way has ever said he's been attacking or negative. Nothing is wrong with Jesus. So when we talk about how can we bring the kingdom of God to earth, what's been coming to me lately is show people that he's real. Don't talk, talking about it's great, but you have to make it abundantly evident. You can't leave the possibility of a perspective of anything else other than fully love, fully understanding, and fully truth and peace. That if you don't if you can embody that and nobody has a bad thing to say about you, well, then you transcend words. Well, that's when we bring the kingdom of heaven on earth. It just show everyone. Show everyone that he's real by being him in your every moment.
Yeah, this is, I was thinking about things to share, and this is probably a good place to wrap up here. I think we're getting 90 minutes in or something. I don't have a hard stop, but just to have pity on our audience, is a little digression. I talked a lot about tribalism and structures and hierarchy and Western civilization, right? Feudalism, the cradle of Western civilization. And I heard a wonderful picture. It talked about there's two kinds of communities, a bounded set and a centered set. So a bounded set, you can think of like a company. You've got employees who they have a contractual covenant relationship. If you are in the company, you're an employee, you have certain trusts, certain privileges, certain obligations, and vice versa. But if you're outside the company, there's no a priori obligation to you. You could be a contractor, you could be a customer, a vendor, whatever. Like, we have point-to-point relationships, but there's no really long enduring obligation. And you know who's in and who's out. And interesting, so it's a bounded set. You always know who's in and who's out, when you're a football team, right? Mm-hmm. And those things are really powerful because you can make, like I talked about it at Apple, the fear of God. Under Steve Jobs, you knew everyone at Apple lived in the fear of Steve Jobs, and they were going to be doing their absolute best for the company or they would be incinerated. And the funny thing was, it created this enormous sense of freedom and peace because you knew everyone else, you could trust them, that they were absolutely going to give their best and do their work most. And if anyone ever didn't do that, they would be incinerated. So you didn't have to defend yourself. And I discovered after leaving Apple after 17 years, the rest of the world does not work this way. There's politics, there's distrust, there's fear, and the fear of God obliterated all lesser fears. And that's the beauty of a bounded set, is knowing that if you're in the tribe, everyone follows the same set of rules. It's simple, it's easy, it's good, right? The problem is that there's this sharp barrier which leads to an inner and outer and all sorts of toxicity. And the only way to maintain that is with a really, really strong hierarchy. And perversely, the greater the good and the more perfect the hierarchy, the higher level of toxicity the entity can sustain.
The bell curve, the 5% here, 5% here, and 90% in the middle.
Right, but the point is that, well, the thing is, if you cut off the 5, it's I'm not sure how you're using that, but the idea is that if it's a really good institution, I mean, America, a lot of people these days really complain about America, but nobody wants to leave it. They want the other people to shape up so they can live with them, right?
Right.
And that's because, whereas a lot of places, they just emigrate, right? And, very few people want to, because, and that's the thing, the more there is to be cherished and treasured, the more toxic it can get because you don't want to leave.
Yeah,
and
well, that's what I meant with the 5% is the bell curve is that there's polar opposites, that there's going to be 5% that do one thing, 5% that do the polar opposite, and then the 90% are going to fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. But here's the interesting thing. And so I'd known this for a while, but without the language. But someone said, well, there's an alternative to the bounded set, and that is the centered set. And if you think of a football team as a bounded set, clearly in and clearly out, a fan is a centered set. The center is clearly the people who show up every day, that there's a game and are there for hours at an end. But there's a smooth curve flowing out of that where the people, there's some mild rivalry for those who are near the center, but there's no real outsiders unless you get to people rooting for the opposite team, I suppose. But what's interesting to me working in Silicon Valley, I worked with something called open source software in the very beginnings of that movement. And an open source project is not a centered set like a company. It's not a bounded set like a company. It's a centered set where you just participate to the extent you do, and you're valued to the extent you participate. There is no hierarchy. There's just the work or the worth or the worship at the center. And the closer you are, the more status you have. But you can flow in and out based on the work without needing somebody at the top to hammer you with the law to keep everyone in behaving.
Right.
And this is a fascinatingly different way. And the question I've been asking myself for the last year or two is, every form of organized Christianity I've known has been a bounded set. And the groups that have not had bounded sets tended to dissolve and disappear after a generation because there was nothing holding them together. But there's this new model of human organization, the bounded set, where there is a work that you are doing. There's a practice that you are pursuing. And the more you pursue and practice, that's the closer you are to the center, but there's no boundaries. And so I've been thinking about that. What is the practice that is the thing that we do that can bind us together so we don't need these institutional structures? And I have a theory about that, if I can maybe close with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can't properly describe it, but the best word I have for it is Christing. Because I think there's two halves of it. One, you have to demonstrate virtue in a broken situation. One of my heroes, guy writes a newsletter called Not Boring, uses the term entropy wrangling. Where there is chaos, you bring order, okay? But that's only half of it, right? Because that could be a father or a dictator or a tyrant to turn chaos into order. The second thing you have to do is absorb all the aggression and negativity of the system into yourself and allow the system to destroy you, like Christ on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing you have to do is have it survive your destruction. So you can think about George Washington, through sheer force of will, winning the Revolutionary War, pulling the squabbling factions together in government, and then choosing to step down, voluntarily surrender power in a way that allowed the next generation to continue on. Now, he didn't do it perfectly. Lincoln had to clean up some of the messes afterwards, but he did it. He did a Christing event of forming something, taking the pain upon himself, and then releasing it back out in generativity for the next generation. And that act of Christing requires extraordinary love, extraordinary security, and extraordinary sacrifice. And practicing that, to me, is the thing that if we do it, we will experience Jesus in our own hearts. Other people will experience the fruit of the cross, the fruit of the Spirit from our lives. And that, I'm starting to believe, is the only thing that can save civilization.
Yeah.
Is a legion of people who are willing to come together and say, hey, let us practice this thing together and demonstrate the worthiness, the worthship of Christ. Don't argue about the Bible and evolution and politics. Like, have opinions, talk about them, but that is not the center. The center is this worship. It is Christing ourselves one with another, learning to get better at it for our own sake and others. That is how the kingdom of God comes.
Yeah. Bring him here by acting like him. That is perfectly said. I love that completely. Do you want to let the people know where they can find you?
Sure. So two things. One, let me share my online presence, and then I would like to pray for you and your audience, if I may. To
Absolutely. But I have one more question after you let everyone know where they can find you.
So I am mostly, the best place to find me, where I'm most commonly, is my blog. So it is the number 2 transform.us. So 2transform.us.
Okay.
I occasionally tweet, but almost never read at Dr. Ernie, at DRERNIE. I'm waffling whether or not I'm going to go back on the Wisdom app. And I generally try to avoid social media. So I'm hard to find elsewhere, but you can post to me on my blog, and you can, I can give you my email. It's publicly on the internet, Ernest.Prabhakar, PRABHAKAR @gmail.com. And that's actually the best way to get a hold of me. And yeah.
And the podcast, no?
Well, I have some different podcasts which are sporadic, and I changed the title on them, so they're not really easy to find. The main one I'm doing is a project I'm calling Discipling by Jesus, which has a YouTube channel and a associated, very rambling podcast that you may or may not be able to find. It was part of it came out of a previous series called The Great Reset, which was much more consistent. We did that for 42 weeks during the pandemic.
Oh, okay.
And that was a crazy adventure, and not very watchable, but extraordinarily powerful learning for me.
Interesting choice of a name, as Klaus Schwab termed it from the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. So
yeah, he picked it up around the same time we did. It overlaps in some ways. Some people hate or love it for various reasons.
Right.
Like words, right? Your experiences with them shape your emotional reaction, and that's why, like, don't get hung up on the words. Use them as just hints to help you find the substance.
Yeah. That's a great way to go into what I am going to ask you next. So the way that I like to end all my conversations, and of course you can pray afterwards, but I want to know, how do you stay grounded in this world where you're walking between two things, whether it's multicultural, whether it's between different sects of Christianity or different religions, or how do you stay centered? How do you stay grounded to being human in this crazy world?
Yeah, if I was better at it, I'd probably have a better answer, but I do have some practices that I do. And so a few years, so I grew up doing like the quiet time religious devotional thing, and I kind of got burnt out on that. So I just stopped doing it in any consistent way. But then the pastor of my church really challenged me. He's a good guy. We've had some differences, but he's always been really good at speaking into my life. And he said, I've been praying, and I feel like God wants you to spend regular daily time with him. So I really took that to heart. But I said, I just can't stand the idea of doing another quiet time, because they were just driving me bonkers, the religiosity of it. Maybe people can benefit from them, but for me, it was just too reminder of my toxic legalistic past. But I want to do something. So I came up with something that my beef with quiet times and Western education in general is all focused on inputs. How much time do you spend? How many verses do you memorize? How many chapters do you read? And like for phase 1, childhood acceptance, that's good. But then it becomes all the things you object against in phase 2. And so I said, okay, what I care about is the outcomes. I want to be filled with, let me actually pull this up here so I can quote myself, because I I actually wrote this down. There's a blog post with this called RSVP on my website, and I have this daily devotional on my app with a template. So the first thing I do is rejoice, is just doing the gratitude journaling. And the hard part of this is writing down everything that happened and meditating until I can be thankful for it. And a lot of days it's easy. Some days it's really like this thing where I really screwed up, or this person did something that really offended me. How do I rejoice over that? Okay. And that can be quick or it can be long. And sometimes I started also writing down the emotional triggers that trigger my amygdala and make me react or see other people react, so that I can have greater conscious awareness of that. The second thing I do is I rate my peace level and to find my shalom. And the idea is that the more peaceful I am, the more I can act wisely. And so I actually give myself a numerical score. Like, is this a 7? Is this an 8? Is this a 9.2? And I track that over time to see, like, am I getting more or less peaceful? And particularly why? What are the things that are making me feel anxious, that are making me feel stressed? And then the third is vision. So I'll do usually a devotional journal, like a page or so, and I'll read that. And sometimes I agree with it. Sometimes I argue with it. Either way, I kind of pick a theme and then I just wrestle with it before God. And a lot of my blog posts come out of these things where I'm wrestling before God. And the idea is that, and what I'm trying to do is to find hope to bring harmony. And so that's the idea of vision, is if I can see these difficult things as fodder for the redemptive that God is doing, then I see them as a reason for hope rather than fear. And then the last part is praise, which for reasons I can't really explain, I ended up putting in the phrase, today I will. And this is my, like today I will trust that God is in my difficult encounters. And just having like a simple phrase or whatever. So that's RSVP, rejoice, shalom, vision, and praise. And that's one of the sort of daily practices I have, which incorporates a lot of these other practices, meditation, gratitude, etc., in a way that's been useful for me for the last several years. It also gives me a nice paper trail in my journaling app, so I can kind of look back and see where I was a year or two ago on a certain date.
Wow, well, that's beautiful. I love all that, my friend. So do you want to take us out on a prayer?
Sure. You go by Emmanuel now, right?
Yeah, Emmanuel or Todd. It doesn't matter either.
Okay. All right. Okay. God, I just thank you for this crazy little brotherhood I have with my brother Emmanuel, Todd, whatever his name is. Words don't matter. Reality is what matters, but words help us. I'm glad that I found his name, his podcast, his website, so that I was able to connect with him. And even as we are trying to find our new name that only you know, I thank you that we can know each other and be part. Lord, I just declare that this is a year of breakthrough and redemption and resurrection. Lord, a lot of us have had 7 years of suffering and toil and loss. And I just hear the voice of the Lord declaring, your years of hard labor are ended. Your years of being alone in the wilderness, where you're fighting uphill against the system. The hills are being made low and the valleys are being filled up because God is preparing a road. It's still a narrow road, but because of the darkness, it will shine so brightly that it'll be easier than ever for people to find it if they dare, if they're willing to take that leap of faith. And what I pray for those who are listening, who some of them may be full of themselves, but I think more of them are probably just feeling so empty and so tired and so sick of themselves and so sick of the people they have to deal with. And I just want to declare to you that everything that you see as trash, as negatives, as regrets, is in fact the treasure that God has placed for those who dare to take a leap of faith. And I pray that as you heard me and Todd interacting with Mimi, that you would see that there is a reality here that is deeper than the darkness, deeper than the abyss, deeper than the shame and the fear that have kept you locked in. And Lord, I ask, first I will declare that God loves you as he loves Jesus. And don't forget what he did to Jesus. He sent him out of heaven and cast him into hell in order that he might achieve eternal glory and be deeply united with all of us. And everything you have experienced is fodder for you to know God, know yourself, and know others with a joy that you cannot now imagine, but I hope you caught a glimpse of during this time. So Lord, I just consecrate these words, this audio, this time, my brother and sister here. Lord, may it be a spark that will light a fire of worship to you. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.
Amen. That was wonderful. All right. So we'll say goodbye to our audience. Goodbye, everybody. We will talk to you later.